Well, hey there, friends, and welcome back to 15-Minute Free Thinking with Carpo. Today I'm going to be talking about psychedelics, namely LSD, because the subject is so vast and wide. I have very different respects for each different psychedelic compound, but I don't really want to get into the technicalities here, but rather kind of the layman benefits, and by layman, just the very basic things that I have learned from psychedelics and why I think they're so important and why I think at this time in history they're more important than ever. You know, psychedelics have gone mainstream over the past 5 years, big time. I mean, Johns Hopkins University has been doing research for quite a while on them, namely mushrooms and MDMA. LSD is kind of still a little in the gray area. I believe that some of the natural compounds, mushrooms tend to be not as long lasting, and so they might be better in a therapeutic setting where you're already relaxing. But the reason I'm going to touch on this topic right now is because I recently reread a good book. What I mean by that is I took a nice journey. I took I took some LSD in the woods and ended up on this rock in the middle of this stream. And I was laying there. I remember how quickly it hit and how I was just laughing to myself and just laughing my ass off for no particular reason. And then for a little while it was kind of a blur. I just laid there in kind of my dreamland as the peak came on. But afterwards I kind of got up, looked around, and we went back to where we had come from, and we explored our minds in the sense that when you take a psychedelic compound, the first part can be very intense. It's almost what I call my cocoon. I go through a chrysalis, is the term that I usually use. And a lot of other people who have taken psychedelics have the same experience. This means that about an hour or so after you've taken it, or less, it starts to hit you, and you kind of literally kind of roll up in a ball. You're not miserable, you're not sad, you're just in another world. And I believe that this cocoon is what allows our mind to kind of reformulate, make some new connections there. And then once we come back to, that's when the real trip begins. It's not about the visuals and the crazy things that you see when you take a psychedelic. It's about the impact it has on your psyche and your life. And by saying rereading a book, what I mean is I've taken psychedelics so many times that every time, even though I learned something new, it's usually that I'm imprinted with the same ideas that I learned before. These are things that, it seems, it at least appears, that nature has a formula for us and for our behavior, for how we should act towards one another, and what we should find important in life. Now, this is, of course, subjective to a lot of people, but I firmly believe that there are certain values that we all share. And there's a common theme that has to do with connection, family, love, understanding, and acceptance that I always come to terms with. Also, one of the biggest issues to remember is you can't take life too serious. So in the end of this video, I'll go over the things that I've learned, the list of the connections that I've made that are a common theme among all the journeys I've taken. And I'm also going to talk a little about microdosing and things like that. So I'm going to do my best to kind of go off the cuff here, since I don't have, I don't have a teleprompter here. A lot of people read off a teleprompter. I guess if I organized my thoughts, I could probably do this a lot quicker, but I really prefer this method of just kind of having a couple notes and ideas. So to get on with it, the reason why I think psychedelics are so important is because we're at a time right now where depression and anxiety are at an all-time high. And also, psychotropic substances, as well as various pharmaceuticals, Wellbutrin and Paxil and Prozac, these things are just being pumped into people. America takes more psychotropic meds than the whole world combined, I believe, the rest of the world combined. We are lunatics over here. We take pharmaceuticals for everything. I mean, we consume most of the opiates in the world, and we're only like 5% of the population. We have a problem. We have a problem because pharmaceutical industries for decades have pumped this stuff out for profit and not for the people. And until people realize this, then they won't understand why so many self-diagnosis things like psychedelics are never really utilized by the pharmaceutical industry. And we're pushed under the rug. It's not for lack of wanting, it's for the realization that they want repeat customers. They don't want somebody who can take LSD and once a year and feel better about themselves without the need of any doctor, without the need of a prescription, right? So we demonize these substances. All the stories you heard about people jumping out windows and suicides and everything else regarding LSD is pretty much bunk. I mean, sure, there's a couple stories. These people who do things while they're under the influence often were already mentally unstable. So before I go further, I want to address one thing about this. I really firmly believe that you should not take psychedelics when you're young. And I also don't think you should take psychedelics if you have a mental instability unless, and what I mean by you know if you feel like you're totally unstable. But sometimes you might not know. And some people are predisposed to psychosis, to go into a full-blown psychosis. I've seen it firsthand twice or three times, I think, in different people. And it's crazy what even one psychedelic journey can do to a person. So use caution. Nothing I'm saying here is advice. Nothing I tell you, you should take everything with a grain of salt and highly consider whether you feel stable enough. But always find a shaman or guru. It could be just a friend who's experienced. That's what you really need if you don't know what to expect. So, moving on. Just be smart. Don't take things by yourself you don't know out in public like a fool. But if you do, you end up in a situation where you're, too far gone. Just remember, it's weird when people take psychedelics. They are so in their own mind, they don't realize to others they just appear like they're drunk or something. When they're laying down or they're kind of out of their mind. But of course, you get to talking to somebody, it's totally different. The thing about psychedelics is they don't slur your speech. They sharpen your mind, and to an extent that you can have a normal conversation with somebody when everything around you is just swirling. And what that tells me is that they don't impact the part of your brain that you still need to think about life, but they shut down the parts that make you worry about what's going on at the current moment, allow new neural connections to form, allowing you to process things differently and have a new emotional response. Fun is part of it. Laughter is part of it. A lot of people say, hey, psychedelics shouldn't be treated lightly. I totally agree. I take them sacramentally, like only once a year, maybe twice, if I'm lucky. But in those times, I find the right set and setting. And I highly recommend, if you don't know what set and setting are, that you research that before you ever take psychedelics. There was a book from Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner, I think it was, called, it was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It was called the Psychedelic Experience, and it was talking about the bardos and the different processes people go through in their belief of dying and going into the underworld, and how it compares to kind of the psychedelic journey. And this is something that most people who have taken these substances can share, these same common threads they've had going through these phases. And there's a very common theme and a very common element in this, which is space and nature and the connection between everything and the fact that it's just okay. And honestly, this is what people really want to hear. You see, we use religion in our society to try to understand things, and science as well, which was never meant to be separate from religion, but rather to help explain more about the world, to help us be more religious. The more I learn about nature and existence, honestly, the more divine it looks. The less random it all seems when you understand symbiosis and chrysalis and the connections in nature, the way that things evolved for some weird reason, things that should have not evolved, right? But here we are. There seems to be a blueprint, an underlying picture, and that's the common theme that I'm always seeing on my journeys. But not having to label it is the major part of this that I'm trying to convey. I don't have to call it Jesus Christ or Buddha or, the whole idea that a person or a human that lived on earth at any time is worth worshiping, to me makes no sense at all. However, as long as the person realizes that that human they're worshiping, whether they think it's a god or not, or maybe a fictional character, it doesn't matter. That's okay. It's a ritual. It's a routine. It's a way for people to connect with the divine. Rituals are fine, as long as you don't think you have the only one. And I think this is the big hang-up that we have. When people say, I practice this way, and others say, good, that's awesome. I practice this way. And then the person says, your way is wrong. And I've seen things in a psychedelic state that I could never even begin to talk about here. I have seen what I called the Godhead at the moment, and it was, if there's an absolute state of connection with the universe and bliss, I hit it for that brief moment, and I could not believe where I was at. Dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, I know a lot of people will probably mention that in the comments. I don't really want to talk about that here because it's another world. It's another world in the sense it's very short acting, and the experience is too hard to process. The reason why I prefer psychedelics is because their processing power, if you take something like that, there's no going back. If you eat a tab of LSD, that's it. You're in for the ride. You can take benzodiazepines to kind of calm down, but generally you're going to ride it out for a good 8 hours, and you'll probably have after effects for the next full day. And they're almost always positive, unless a person doesn't expect to be dosed, unless they've gone through, well, the U.S. government and their MK Ultra program, they dosed probably thousands of people without their knowing. That's a totally different story. But even some of those people had a good time. There's a story where they dosed a bunch of army soldiers, and there's video of it, and they all started laughing, and they realized dosing the soldiers wasn't helping. It was just making them question their joining the army in the first place. And that's the thing. LSD makes you question everything. And I know that a lot of folks out there might think of LSD as a chemical, because it is in, micrograms. You're taking 100 to 300 micrograms, which is a very small amount of a drug, and it is chemically synthesized. However, its base derivative is from the ergot fungus, ergotamine, which is from a fungus that grows on wheat. And through history, people have had contaminated wheat with the ergot fungus, had to eat the bread from it, and ended up having what they believe historically, perhaps, to be mass psychosis at times. There's no way to really trace it because LSD, ergot, the whole thing, it's in and out of the system really quick. So it's not like you can find it in the bones, or even though when I was a kid, we were told that LSD was stored in the spine and that you could have a flashback if it got released from your spinal fluid. Like, there are so many myths that went through the world, things like strychnine in the LSD. I learned that most of it was complete nonsense. And, I started, when I started taking it, it was like back in 1990, I think, 91. And this was back when there was a huge resurgence. And it went all the way to 2000 where there was a huge bust, and then it kind of disappeared for a little while and then came back. But I was a teenager and I discovered LSD, and I found that it completely rearranged my brain in the way that I thought about nature and life. Like, I was raised by my father to respect nature. He'd taken it before, I know, but it wasn't something we'd ever talked about. He passed away when I was 15, so I really didn't, ever talk to him about it. But my parents weren't trippers or anything, and I didn't have any real gurus, so I had to basically kind of direct myself. And my friends and I discovered it, had really, basically, living in Portland, you could walk down there and just pick it up for, pretty cheap. And give it a year or two, and I was going to, hitchhiking to Grateful Dead shows in Eugene and Cali and Seattle and buying sheets and cutting them up, and it was one of those weird experiences where, you're kind of immersed in a psychedelic culture. At least every weekend I would take it. And during that time, I learned a lot. Eventually, it all culminated when I was about, I would say, 19. And one night, I picked up some acid from this guy who worked at 7-Eleven. His name was Troy. He was actually the guy who we thought he was the older guy, the cool guy, and he had a tattoo on his hand that said fear. So we decided to do hate on our hands. We actually tattooed our knuckles like a few days later because we thought it was so cool with the spider web. Even though it was a prison tattoo, it was pretty stupid, but that's another story altogether. I went down there and I was by myself and he said, hey, I'll sell you 6 for 10 because he was always selling. They had the guy at Safeway selling joints from the milk cooler, which he'd push them through. And then next door was 7-Eleven where I could go get acid. And I got some, and he said, I'll give you 6 for 10. But he said, look, because usually around then they were 3 for 10. Maybe a little cheaper. He said, but don't think these are weak. He's like, dude, I'm hooking you up because these are awesome. This is strong stuff. Just please be careful. Just take one. Take one. I was like, yeah, I've heard that before. All right, I'll take one. So I took the TriMet, the bus home, got there that night, just, kind of mid-evening. I took one, and I waited an hour or so, and I was like, I'm not feeling a whole lot. Being stupid, I should have known better, I took 2 more. I waited another hour, and right at the end of that, I thought, this is pretty nice. I might as well just take the other 3, and I ate all 6 of them, and I'm going to tell you that night was miserable. It was way too much. You can definitely overdo it. If I wasn't more mentally stable, I could imagine a person losing their mind and completely. I wanted to leave. I contemplated suicide at the moment. I didn't think about doing it, but it went through my mind. And when something goes through your mind on psychedelics and you're all alone, it kind of like repeats. You get into this repeating mindset, and I'm like, no, I got to fight this. I'll turn on the TV. That didn't work. It just looked like I felt like I was in the TV. And then I looked at the ceiling and it was right there at my face. And so I closed my eyes, I went into a fetal position, and I just laid there till the dawn. Problem was, the next day I was supposed to help my mom move because I was living with her at the time. It was a bad time. She wasn't happy with me. I did some stupid shit. But the point being, after that I didn't take any psychedelics for years, like 3 or 4 years. Until I met my wife and we ate mushrooms one night and listened to Modest Mouse and kind of turned everything around. So here I am years later again, and I've got back into kind of taking them regularly, trying to find that connection with the past that I already knew. The thing about psychedelics is, as I said, the pharmaceutical industry basically wants repeat customers, whereas psychedelics kind of allow you to process something pretty quickly. And I should say, have a quick experience, take something once, and then kind of process what you've learned. It's an intense experience, but it can be very revealing. And that's why I'm a little bit opposed to microdosing. Microdosing is when you take a sub-psychedelic threshold dose. It might be a 10th or even a 20th of a normal dose, to where you can maybe barely feel it or not feel it at all most of the time. Now, I understand what people are trying to achieve by this, but I think that there's a misunderstanding as to, I'm not saying it's all placebo. I think a lot of people it could be, but I think that it really has to do with the fact that it's not the actual substance in your body filling those receptors, right? Acting as serotonin that really makes you, gives you that insight or awareness about life. It might take away some edge or anxiety, but I think that the intense experience is the one that gives us the most insight because it breaks down all the barriers. If you've never been there, then I can't explain it, but there's a point where everything is revealed. The veil comes down. You start to see things as they really are. It's not like your average medicine, your average antidepressant or anxiolytic. It starts out with fear sometimes, processing your shit. But God and emotion can be understood clearly when you are in a deep trip. And afterwards, you can process those things that your mind was able to process because you shut down your frontal cortex. And shutting down the frontal cortex allows us to think differently. And I don't know if that exactly happens with microdosing, but there's a long history of symbolism. There's a reason why people made tie-dye in the 60s. It represents kind of some of the visuals that you see, but it goes back to ancient times. Paisley, all these different psychedelic Middle Eastern symbols, these all come from a psychedelic state, not necessarily always induced by a substance, because there are endogenous compounds in our brain, which just means that we produce them ourselves. Just like opiates, which we also have endorphins, which is endorphins, you've heard of that, and that's endogenous morphine, right? So we also have endogenous bliss chemical of THC, which we have our own version of that. It's called I can't remember what it's called now, damn it. But it translates to bliss molecule. And there's also natural psychedelics. DMT is produced within the brain too. So it must be something, our brains respond to drugs like this because we have them naturally available in times. So we want to supplement that to better understand who we are. And so what do we learn? The first thing, as I mentioned, is connections, family, love, the things that really matter. The next thing that I always learn is that basically we are all one. And looking at people's hearts and intentions is much more important than judging anyone by their clothes or one thing they did or just misunderstanding. People are so judgmental. There's nothing wrong with judging people when they deserve it. But if you're judging people you don't know, you're just, completely out of your mind. The next one is that nature listens and also speaks. I think that this one is super crucial. Nature listens to us, and if we really ask for help, if we really need something, and we speak to nature. Damn fruit fly in here. I don't know where he's coming from. Nature is basically what a lot of people would call God. So I guess what you would say is you're just saying prayer. Basically the same thing. It might not always work though. You can't expect miracles. Nothing is a miracle. Things just happen. They happen or they don't happen. And but I think that if we speak to nature, nature will listen. And I also think if we're willing to walk out in the woods, nature speaks to us. I mean, I've had weird things happen in the woods. I remember going out hunting for a new plant one time, and I wanted to find some healing plant that I'd never seen before. And I asked, and I was talking as I was walking along this little path, and it dead ended. So I went up the hill and sat by this tree, and I looked down, and there was a bunch of Indian pipe or ghost pipe. It's Monotropa uniflora. It's a white flower, saprophytic, which means it grows basically between the fungi and the trees. It's a white flower that's pollinated. It's beautiful, and it doesn't produce chlorophyll. So it's also very medicinal. And ever since I've been fascinated with it, I mean, talking to nature, you get results. You might just call it correlation rather than causation, and that's possible. But it happens so often, if you don't think that there's some connection with nature, it's pretty absurd, because it's hard not to see that when you're out there. The next thing I've learned is that laughter is divine. The connection is great, but the laughter, being able to actually laugh about things, there's Lucy, is probably one of the most important things that we have in our lives. We get so many endorphins, and we produce so much serotonin when we laugh, and these things can be so beneficial to the psyche. Another common theme that I often see when I'm tripping is borders, and how borders are just ideas, and how funny it is when you look at a map and everything's divided into colors and countries. When you see the world as a whole in your mind, you can realize that none of that really matters. There's cultures between borders, so many different types of people. It doesn't mean we don't need them. That's not what I'm getting at. But just the ridiculous nature of how much we protect ourselves over the idea of nationalism, when really that's just standing up for a government and the whole ridiculous nature of authoritarianism. And that's why they were scared of LSD, because it broke down those walls. It made people realize that they were being taught by people who didn't know shit. You know, why should I ever have to listen to somebody else's version of what's right and wrong? Okay, people would say, well, there's a law, and a person, you know, we made these laws. But did we? Often these laws were made by those in charge. And then the next people moved in. Maybe we don't have those same values. We had some stupid laws in the past, you know. That's why, you know, I was arrested for cannabis when I was younger, twice. And that's pretty much bullshit, because it's legal now. It's not even a big deal anymore. You know, I've got felonies for cannabis and for mushrooms, when now it's not even a frickin' ticket. It's ridiculous. But that's how it goes. Things change. So understanding that borders are ideas is no different than realizing that laws are just ideas, and that humans are very fallible. Another thing is to be yourself. Be authentic. That's probably one of the most important things that I've learned. Don't try to follow the suit and be like other people just because it's more comfortable, because you'll always be happier being yourself in the end. I've realized that energy moves between groups, and that the competition is natural, right? So a lot of people have this idea of a future utopia where everyone just gets along and shares. I believe that we need some adversity and competition and frustration and a little bit of self-protectiveness, because if we let down our guard, then we become weak. If we become weak, we get eaten alive, not just by each other, but by nature. I don't think there will ever be a time when everyone will be on board and be peaceful. And even if there's a few who are still violent, what do you do with them? What are you going to do? Put them in prison forever? Kill them? I mean, being violent to avoid violence, it's the reason we got into this mess in the first place. I believe in like local justice, local street justice for the problems that we have. But that's a little more difficult. The last couple things is that I've realized that everyone wants to be kind if you just give them a chance. Even some of the harshest people out there. If you just talk to them one-on-one, they usually really don't disagree as much as you think. That they just maybe have a different view of something and don't realize your view, and realize maybe it doesn't even matter. Maybe they just had a bad day. And the very last thing, and I think the most important, is dust to dust, ashes to ashes. We all will perish. And this is why many people are taking psychedelics for end-of-life wellness, because it gives them a new perspective on the fact that they're mortal, you know, they're mortal, and their mortality is coming to an end, and their lives are going to pass away. And a lot of these people are young, or they have cancer, you know, they're leaving families behind, and that's horrible. Being able to come to terms with death is very difficult for many people, especially when they're not ready to go. Psychedelics, they give you hope that there's something deeper. And so we've not only got end-of-life wellness, but we've got anxiolytics or anti-anxiety, we've got antidepressant effects, we've got long-term benefits from these substances. And naturally, they're still illegal, you know. But I believe that that's changing pretty quickly. And I guess my only advice to people would just be to be careful. Don't take too much. Don't what you call redose. You know, a lot of people like to keep taking more, because when people say psychedelics aren't addictive, I agree with that to an extent. There's no physical addiction to psychedelic compounds, but there can be a very, very strong mental addiction, a desire to get back to that comfort, that I felt so good and I saw the world as it was. I need to be in that state so I can process life. No, you don't. You're just using that state to tweak your brain a little bit to get to a point where you can process in daily life. Some psychedelics help people quit addictions overnight. They can totally reformulate your brain, especially ibogaine from the iboga, and that's something much more dangerous, because that needs to be dealt with by an expert, because you can die from that. Whereas LSD or psilocybin, the most likely thing would be a mental breakdown. You would not be able to eat enough psychedelic mushrooms to die. It's impossible. If you're talking about like standard cubensis mushrooms, you would not be able to even eat enough to kill yourself. But you could feel so high you would be miserable. You don't want to take more than you need. Some people only take a gram. I've taken 5 grams. I've taken 7.5 grams. We split a half ounce, my friend and I, and it was an amazing experience. But a little too much for the average person, and probably more than I'd want to take again. But I did it and had an experience. And, it's, yeah. Maybe I'll get into dimethyltryptamine on a separate video, because that is, as Terence McKenna said, like being shot out of a rocket to the moon. I do not believe that the entities that you see are necessarily real, but rather a process of seeing your own subconscious. But like I said, that's for another story. I just wanted to talk about basic psychedelics. Had a nice journey. It was fun, and I was able to, kind of renew my understanding of myself. And I think that's what it's best for. So be well. Take care of each other. Thank you all for listening. This is the 15-minute free thinking podcast. Carpo out. And if you found this video useful and you'd like to contribute, you can visit me on my Patreon, which is Carpo719. This will be available as a video and as a podcast. So all the podcast platforms, if you want to download it for free, or YouTube. And I'm hoping that it's not something that's, YouTube's still censoring. It seems like it's always been a problem, but that's why I have the, podcast version. Also wanted to say I appreciate you all, and treat each other with respect, Don't let other people's bullshit get to you. And if you're still watching the news, turn that off. That's the best way to get your psyche clear. I'll see you all next time. Be well. Have a good night. Be careful out there. Peace.